Wondering what the calendaring feature in Cherwell is all about and how to use it? If so, you've come to the right place. Hi, I'm Jonathan Burdick, Senior Solutions Consultant and Architect with Excalibur Data Systems. Today we're going to go over the calendar feature, what it is, what it's not, what it can do, and how to configure it. Now, before we get into the calendar features, let's get some bad news out of the way, if you could even call it bad news. All right. The calendar feature in Cherwell is not a way to schedule your day. Like it's not a substitute for Microsoft Outlook, as an example. So that's not its purpose. Rather, it exists and it derives its value from being able to provide a date-oriented visual representation of any record in the system that has some time element to it. So for example, one of the more popular needs in this space might be change management, and that's actually what we will look at briefly today. And so because change management not only typically has different change types, and we often have a start date and an end date, this becomes actually a very, very valuable way to display change records that are pending in your environment. So I only say this because I do believe that there are systems out there where the calendaring feature has a bit more of a personal element to it, if you will. Now, that's not to say that we couldn't configure a calendar of, say, all of our pending work, but just to say that the calendaring in Cherwell is not an appointment-oriented kind of thing. So, with all of that out of the way, the calendars can be found within the Rich client in their own item manager, and that item manager is found under Tools, Calendar, Calendar Manager. Now, you can configure this within the context of a blueprint via the administrative client. However, we're just going to explore the calendar functionality in the Rich client for today. Now, there's a couple of defaults in this system that I have. We have change, we have this IT calendar, and we have this thing called My Tasks. So essentially anybody that's logged in at the time could see anything that was open for them from a task standpoint or whatever is configured in here exactly. You can create a record very quickly here by right-clicking in the white space and clicking New, or clicking the green button at the very top in the upper left-hand corner. This will create you a blank calendar item. But for our purposes, we will explore the change calendar item. So I'll right-click and click Edit, and you can see the basic configuration displayed there. So there's some basic components that we need to deal with here. The name, a description if you're so moved, some title text that would take the place of the name when it's displayed. The default view, we have a couple of different ways to display the visual content by default. And then when your workday starts and ends, the bookends from a time standpoint, and whether you need weekends in that view. Sometimes you might, sometimes you might not. So with the basics covered here, now we really move into the business end of the calendar, which was really each of the various calendar items that we want to display. In the case of change management here, you can see that there have been 5 calendar items that are created. Now, a thing about the calendar items, you are not restricted to a single business object in this case. In fact, in this particular example, we have 4 calendar items, emergency, normal, standard, and completed, that are being sourced from the change business object. However, this one at the top, entitled service schedules, that's coming from a completely different business object. So you can mix and match to your heart's content here. Of course, just keep in mind that some of these things combined together might not make a whole lot of sense or complement one another very well, but that's kind of for you to decide as you start your calendaring journey. You also don't need multiple items here if you don't want, but you'll need at least one for it to be of any value to anybody. But just saying that it doesn't always have to be this complex. Now, we can, when you have existing items, you can delete them or edit them. So you can always come back to these records and modify how they're displayed and what kind of terms they're displayed on. Or you can create a new one by clicking the green plus button there. Now, we always have to associate each of these calendaring items with a business object. All right, there's no real way around that. So we will select that from the list of items that are in the dropdown. Now, you might be asking, well, how do those items get into the list? And that would be a legitimate question. Because the calendaring functionality really runs on a query, whether it's a specific query that we have created or just sort of a generalized query of all records, we would need to configure this availability within the business object properties of a given object. So if I flip over to the admin client and I create a new blueprint and I edit the business object and click business object properties at the top, we're going to want to make sure that our object is available in the search manager. And so what the common element between all of the objects shown in the dropdown is that they are available within the search manager in this system. So if you don't see something that you need here, you'll need to make sure that you edit your business object properties in order to select it. Now you'll give your item a name, and so that's what it will be called within the calendar list. And then we will either query all of the records that exist for this business object, which is not necessarily recommended in all cases, or probably the more recommended method would be to designate a query of our choice, which will filter the data down, and that will keep your performance optimal so that your system doesn't necessarily have to query every record that ever existed in the system for a particular business object. So when you hit the ellipses to the right of the query dropdown, you'll simply be brought out to the search manager, where you can either utilize an existing search criteria for the particular object that you have selected, or you can create a new one. So if you're not familiar with how to create searches, that would be a great place to start. They are not complicated, but my recommendation would be to generate a search result that meets your needs and that you can validate that is correct, and then be pulling it into the calendaring functionality afterwards. So you can create the searches on the fly, so that's not that big of a deal, but just become familiar with it so that you can be feeding your calendar good information. And then you can give this thing a color, and you can choose from the entire color palette or provide something custom there for you. Now, there are 4 basic fields that we deal with for displaying the content in the variety of calendar views that we have. We have start date, end date, header text, and display text. All right. Now, you will always have to have a start date field of some type. The system isn't going to let you not have this. So in the case of, say, building, this would be perhaps a poor example of something that we would display in the calendar, you can see that really there are not very many date or date time fields in that object. All right, so really the most legitimate one would be when the business object record was created, which might not be of any real value, right? So just keep this in mind that we're always going to have to designate a start date. Now you can designate a date field that is simply reporting the date, or you could do one that is reporting the date and time, but you're going to need at least something there. You don't need an end date, although in many cases the end date certainly is applicable. For changes, as an example, that's often the case where we have a proposed start and a proposed end. We probably want to put those bookends in here so that we get the proper display in the calendar. Now then, the header text and the header display text, rather, as you can see, you are limited to the text fields in the system. And if you notice, we're not able to perform any advanced expression compilation here. Oftentimes in the system, you'll see ways to use a stored expression, or even create a custom query or a custom expression rather, right in this configuration space, but in the calendar we're not. So if selecting, for example, a field for header text or display text does not really get all of the information that you want to potentially display there, one trick is to create an additional field or two on your business object, set it as a calculated value to concatenate other content from the record into this field just solely for the purpose of calendar display. Now, fair warning on that, when we take a look here in a moment with at the ways that we can view the calendar, not the data that you select here is not always going to be displayed in its entirety. So I just, you shouldn't necessarily expect that if you were to do something more sophisticated here, that everything would show up all the time. So I just wanted to tell you about that. But I personally have done that for a couple of clients on occasion because they really wanted to have as much information as feasible displayed there, or potentially displayed in a view for people to consume. We also have default date time options. So if, for example, there's no end date, we can say, well, these things are just generally going to show up in the calendar as 2 hours long. And if the start time on these, we can define a start time if there's no time specified. And that would be primarily if your start date field was just simply configured as a date field and not a date time field. So finally, in the configuration, we have these options at the bottom, and these options delineate how much or how little we are going to allow users or consumers of the calendar content to interact with it in some capacity. So you can probably see here, without even much explanation, that it is possible to allow people to create new records of a particular type right from the calendar. We also could allow users to edit this. We could also allow users, under certain circumstances, to drag the record around, which essentially would mean changing the start date and the end date, as well as resizing the element here, so changing one dimension of the record at a time from a start time or end time perspective. Okay. A lot of times people do not want a lot of interaction with the calendar, so they disable this functionality. so that it really just becomes a viewable, consumable exercise, not something that people are really interacting with for the purposes of manipulating records from that view. Since we have a little bit more ground to cover, this is a great stopping point. So that's it for part 1, and next week we will continue with part 2. With that, have a great day.